How to be normal. This videotape should help.
Are you tired of being called a freak? Do people throw you out of their homes? Well, do they?
Yes, and yes.
Then join me as I take you on a journey into normality.
Normality.
The year is 2023, and surely it's no secret that women's roles and the expectations of how women ought to present themselves in society have come a very long way. With the slow death of the cult of domesticity, the last century has been a constant fight of trying to claim the many things that women were denied and robbed of, all in the name of societal norms and gender roles. Women literally went from not being able to smoke cigarettes in public without being faced with major criticism and disapproval, to being able to own their own property, keep their maiden name after marriage, serve on a jury, and serve in the military, and not just as nurses or other roles that were unpaid for, but as soldiers, and that is just in the US alone. In Africa, particularly southern and eastern Nigeria, women couldn't vote and participate in political activities until 1979, and what's crazy is that is not even half a decade ago. In China, it wasn't until the late 1930s that women could initiate divorces. Before then, they just had to stick it out whether they were happy or not. If the husband didn't want to get a divorce, no one was leaving the marriage. In France, contraception had not been authorized until 1967. In Australia, married women could not freely apply for a passport without needing permission from their husbands until 1983. Hell, women couldn't even freely wear pants without facing major criticism until somewhere past the mid-20th century. But look at us now, wearing pants left and right, and not just wearing them, but looking damn good in them too. And the list goes on. But whilst there has been quite an evolution with gender roles and the expectations of presentation plunged upon women, we still have a very long way to go with societal norms. And I'm not just talking about what women can't do, but more so what they're expected to do, or rather how they're expected to be and behave and generally present themselves in society. For the longest time, being a woman meant adhering to traditional standards of femininity. Femininity being qualities or attributes regarded as characteristics of women or girls, with examples throughout history of what the pinnacle of femininity looked like. For instance, we had Queen Victoria, who was regarded as the ideal woman during the Victorian era, with purity, chastity, and modesty being some of the many qualities that were aimed at in an attempt to fit into the standard of womanhood. But what is ideal womanhood? And who is this ideal woman? Well, according to wordhippo.com, the term ideal woman is defined as a woman who is greatly admired for her accomplishments. But what are these accomplishments? According to Oxford Dictionary, the word ideal means satisfying one's conception of what's perfect, or simply put, a person or thing regarded as perfect. Now, adding the word woman to this definition gives us a woman regarded as perfect. Interesting. Now, the concept of the ideal or perfect woman is one that is quite subjective. It is greatly influenced by culture, religion, as well as preferences and opinions of what and how different people choose to define the ideal woman. For instance, in religion, particularly Christian religion, the ideal woman usually spoken of when setting an example for Christian women is the Proverbs 31 woman. In this final chapter of the book of Proverbs, verses 10 to 31 describe a woman who is a good wife to her husband, a woman who takes good care of her home and is hardworking, a woman who is at service to those who are in need, a woman who brings her husband honor and is wise in her speech. And in verse 29, the King James Version of the Bible says that many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all, describing a woman who has succeeded at fitting into the ideal of Christian womanhood. In Greek mythology, we are presented with Penelope, who is featured as a very important character in the poem Odyssey. According to the poet Homer, Penelope is described as being exceptionally beautiful, but her beauty is said to not only be limited to her outward appearance, as he goes on to describe her as having an inner beauty, one which overshadows her outward beauty. At one point, the poem goes as follows: Athena has bestowed on her wisdom of mind and excellence of skill, in beautiful devices manifold, beyond all others, such as is not told, even of those renowned in former time, Alcaean women, lovely tressed of old, Tyro, Alcmene, and Mycene crowned. Even among these, the equal was not found. in Wise Devices to Penelope. The last 3 lines compare Penelope to Tyro, a princess of high virtue, and Alcmene and Mycene, both of whom were very well known for their idealized feminine traits and well praised for it. And yet Penelope is described as surpassing them in wisdom, skill, and virtue. Because of this, Penelope is usually regarded as the ideal woman, with an emphasis on her faithfulness, passivity, loyalty, and patience in regards to her ability to wait for her husband who had gone away to war for 20 years, despite having been presented with many different suitors during her wait for her husband's return. And in culture, particularly pre-modern Japanese culture, Yamato Nadeshiko, which according to Wikipedia is a Japanese term meaning personification of an idealized Japanese woman, or the epitome of pure feminine beauty. This particular ideal is characterized as poised, decorous, kind, gentle, graceful, humble, patient, virtuous, respectful, honest, and faithful. All traits that were perceived as being very rare. But despite all the variations in the description of the ideal woman across cultures, religions, and times and places, there happens to be a number of recurring themes as to who the ideal woman is to this day. A quick Google search, for instance, has traits like humility, integrity, gratitude, self-respect, forgiveness, nurturing, compassion, and patience as recurring. And so going back to our earlier definitions of the ideal woman, in order for any woman to be admired or to fit into the ideal, she has to accomplish being patient, graceful, nurturing, accommodating, passive, humble, and should not be too loud, aggressive, or outspoken. And well, let's just say that the ideal is quite the fucker.
Squidward, how does one become normal?
Well, how about you start by... Getting away from me, you little creature!
What's wrong with me?
I pray that I would go viral. My whole life full of idols. My whole life a recital. I wanted all of the titles.
Now, it needs not to go unsaid that a lot of the expectations that come with conforming to the ideal are highly unrealistic and stereotypical. The feminine ideal pushes a very saturated picture-perfect image of what women should be like. One such expectation is that of cleanliness. Being beautiful and very clean is an expectation society plunges upon women quite early on in life. And whilst almost every quote-unquote normal functioning human being is expected to be clean or at least maintain some form of cleanliness to a degree, this expectation is especially heavy on women. Even as little girls, women are expected to maintain a certain sense of purity, with criticism and other forms of judgment being triggers of guilt for not living up to the standard. This beautiful, clean, pure, and almost angelic pedestal pushes women to be more secretive of things that, even though are natural and inevitable for normal human existence, taint this picture-perfect image. One such thing being, yes, you guessed it, menstruation. Don't we all just love some bleeding every month? And even though a lot of the myths surrounding the impurity of menstruation have died down in a lot of parts of the world, there are other issues that remain quite prevalent. Other ridiculous beliefs and expectations that fall under the feminine ideal include the idea that women don't eat very much. I know, as dumb as that sounds, it's something that some people still have in the backs of their heads to this day, believe it or not. I remember when I was about 10 and a girlfriend and neighbor of mine told me that one day she and her extended family were having lunch when, some good time into the meal, her uncle made a comment saying that she, my friend, was eating too much for a girl. When she looked up at him to see if, maybe he was joking or something, his face was dead serious and he was not at all smiling. Instead, he had this puzzled look on his face, like she was doing something out of the ordinary, something alien. And so she immediately felt uncomfortable and decided to get up after taking a few more bites of the food. And no one, literally no one, said anything in her defense. Everyone just continued eating like nothing had happened. And I remember just how sunken I felt hearing her talk about how she had suddenly become very self-conscious whenever she was eating with her family. How she made it a thing to get up a few minutes into each meal and leave, lest her femininity be put into question again. All of a sudden, she became super aware of how much food she was consuming. And not just that, but how much other people were seeing her consume, being sure to take only a little bit when around others, because according to her uncle and his perception of feminine behavior, women shouldn't eat very much. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what unrealistic and stereotypical feminine standards can do. Because the feminine ideal sets a blueprint of how women are expected to live their lives and present themselves in society from the time they are little girls, walking away from its impossible standards can be a hard hard thing to do, especially when the ideal is all that has been preached to you your entire life. It doesn't seem to matter where you go, there will always be something or someone that reminds you when you slip up that that's not very ladylike of you. A term used to remind you of your failure to reach the ideal feminine standards, thus chipping away on your womanhood, making you feel less than you already are. And while some people are blessed with the ability to raise two middle fingers at the ideal and go about their day, this is unlikely for others. Because not fitting into the ideal is one thing, but having other people around you, especially those whose opinions of you care about greatly, point out the discrepancies and heavily criticize you for not adhering to the way you're expected to be can be quite disheartening. And being a people pleaser does not help. In moments like these, the unrealism of what is and what isn't fades out, leaving this pressure to just want to be normal and be accepted without judgment. Other expectations, such as the belief that women are naturally nurturing and maternal beings, can be extremely demanding and hard to work around due to their high generalization and existence in almost every society. They are almost inescapable, and publicly stepping out of these ideals can easily put one at risk of experiencing gender role discrepancy strain. Gender role discrepancy is defined as a person's inability to live up to the expectations of their laid out gender roles. According to a study conducted on feminine gender role discrepancy strain and women's self-esteem in daily and weekly life, gender role discrepancy strain is defined as the consequence of failing to conform to gender roles. These quote-unquote consequences being stress, strain, motivating thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that can be harmful to the self and others. The study states that nurturance, passivity, communality, dependence, and attractiveness are qualities that fall under the gender role expectations for women, and that failure to live up to these expectations brings about negative self-relevant outcomes such as depressed mood, shame, and guilt. The study also goes on to highlight that women who suffer from feminine gender role strain and those who experience low felt femininity on a context level basis both experience low self-esteem. This means that having someone demean your femininity based off of, let's say, your reaction to something in a phrase such as, "That's not very feminine of you," is enough to chip away on your confidence. But that's the thing actually. A woman's outward expression of anger is used against her because according to the ideal, as a woman, why are you angry? And even if you are, why are you showing it? Because as a woman, you're expected to be calm and collected at all times, even in the midst of a storm. All in all, not fitting into what society deems as the norm can be quite frustrating, leaving this longing for a sense of freedom from these standards.
Middle.
The unlikable woman trope is a term used to describe a fictional woman who does not conform to the expectations of a quote-unquote good woman in terms of appearance, behavior, or speech. This means that the question of whether or not a given female character is likable or unlikable is highly dependent on whether or not she abides by the feminine rules of how she's expected to conduct herself. So if a female character ought to be considered likable or even liked by an audience, she has to possess certain qualities, particularly idealized feminine qualities. Anything other than that and you have yourself an unlikable female character, therefore implying that likability equals being a quote-unquote good woman and unlikability equals not being a good woman or being a quote-unquote bad woman. In Anna Bogutskaya's book, Lord, I hope I'm not butchering her name, Unlikable Female Characters, the women pop culture wants you to hate, she lists and breaks down 9 tropes that fall under this extensive category of women who transgress against the feminine ideal. Each trope is used to depict a woman that steps out of the norms of moral acceptability and appropriateness, with very complex characters that have qualities that are presented as not being very pleasant or appealing to the viewers, hence making them unlikable. In the foreword of the book, British journalist, editor, and author Terry White breaks down the notion of these characters being termed as unlikable and why. She writes, "What do we and what do they mean by likable? It's been said that likability means relatability, and that relatability is what a female character needs in a film or TV show for that film or TV show to succeed commercially. I call bullshit on 2 fronts. Firstly, this book forms a long list of successful films with unlikable protagonists. And secondly, most if not all women that I know can relate to an unlikable woman. Whether men and some women want an unlikable woman on screen is another question entirely. Because to me, likability means palatability, and specifically how palatable these characters are to a patriarchal world that in many cases still likes its women, both fiction and otherwise, to be supine and silent. We are to be nice, to be good, to be soft and yielding, to say we like it when we absolutely don't, to be grateful and gracious, to swallow our anger and resentment. We aren't to resist or fight, attack or confront. We shouldn't violate the social codes and norms that have offered a blueprint, really a straitjacket, for women for generations. End quote. Because if you really think about it, society's labeling of these women as quote-unquote bad women because they are unlikable is heavily inconsistent due to the fact that the question of their likability goes beyond whether they are morally right or wrong, but more so whether or not they are digestible enough to the liking of a society that idealizes its women. When first introduced, although not termed until later on, the depiction of the unlikable female character was rooted in villainizing these complex characters as a cultural warning sign showing the audience the punishment for stepping out of line. Films like The Maltese Falcon of 1941, Double Indemnity of 1944, and Mildred Pierce of 1945 would all consist of unlikable female characters that dared to do things contrary to the feminine ideal, only to later face some form of consequence for doing so, thus reinforcing a need for women to live by the ideal and to fear having to do the opposite. In the book, Anna states that when we see ourselves being punished on screen, we take this as a lesson. We get used to seeing our suffering and we internalize what we have to do in order to avoid it. And that is just on the side of the way the films were packaged and presented to us. On the other hand, we have the reactions that people have to seeing the depiction of a woman deemed as unlikable. In 1856, French novelist Gustave Flaubert published Madame Bovary, a novel that went on to be one of his greatest works of art. Well, that, and one that he was sued for, all because he dared to depict a woman that did not fit into the idealized expectations of feminine behavior. The novel tells the story of Emma Bovary, aka the unlikable female character in this story, a bored housewife who finds married life to be so disappointing that she ends up seeking out a sense of fulfillment outside marriage, committing adultery amongst other things. In the end, Emma finds that too to be quite disappointing and seeks out other ways to find satisfaction, leaving her heavy in debt with an inability to pay back what she owed, causing her to commit suicide. And so when the novel was published in December of 1956, let's just say that people didn't really welcome it with open arms, because surely how could he betray everything the feminine ideal stands for and depict such an unlikable woman? Even though at the time there were books that depicted a man's infidelity, but you didn't see those getting criticized as heavily as one that depicted a woman's infidelity. In the end, Gustave Flaubert was accused of obscenity and had to go to trial for it in January of 1857. He was later acquitted of all charges in February that same year, which only added to the popularity of the book, making it a bestseller.
They be downloading my stuff so they can hear it and talk crap about it, but it benefits me.
Other books that faced major criticism for depicting an unlikable female character was The Awakening by American author Kate Chopin, published in 1899. Although Kate wasn't taken to trial for it, the novel was censored after sparking controversy because of its depiction of female sexual desire and for its depiction of a protagonist who chafed against social norms and established gender roles. Because similar to Henrik's 1879 novel, A Doll's House, the woman in the novel abandons her husband and children for self-fulfillment. And even though her actions are not to be condoned, stories of fathers living to buy milk and never returning go way back, but you didn't see those getting censored. Anna writes that the manner in which cinema and television are made and received by audiences is a cultural thermometer, a reflection of a time and a place. Fundamentally though, it tells us about the types of women that people are willing to accept in real life, how audiences and critiques respond to these characters, whether they are embraced or not, and how harshly we judge them tells us so much about what we're willing to embrace in women. end quote. And so when we have modern unlikable women like Skylar White, a character in the 2008 to 2013 TV show Breaking Bad, severely criticized for doing the same thing that her husband is heavily praised for, which is dealing drugs and money laundering, it shows us how far we've come, yet how very little society has improved in its ability to cut women, and fictional women for that matter, some slack. Other than being an annoying, nagging wife, Skylar White was also heavily criticized on the basis that she was a morally compromised mother and wife, but yet her husband did not receive as much criticism even though he was the one committing murder on top of everything, which greatly highlights the issue of gender that remains so carefully hidden. The hate against the fictional character Skylar White got so bad that it was also directed at the actress Anna Gunn, who played the role, all because women, like the unlikable female characters, are expected to fit into some box. Because in order to get a pass at being an unlikable woman, you need a valid excuse as to why you are the way you are, or else you are to be punished. And whilst men are allowed to play all these roles that are morally contradicting, women can only do so much. So now, is the fuss over unlikable female characters and the portrayal of them a way of promoting moral decay and encouraging women to act immoral or in ways that are not right? The answer is no. Because what these characters do is give women a breather, a sense that it's okay to not walk on the tightrope of feminine standards, and that it's normal to mess up and be flawed and to not be graceful and soft, and that it's okay if you want to do more than just nod and smile when something provocative is thrown at you and when you're disrespected and treated unfairly. That the fact that you're angry and have chosen not to forgive that person that grieved you doesn't mean your emotions are invalid because someone woke up one day and decided that that's not the way of femininity. Because to be honest, what is femininity if not an oppressive box that suppresses the need and desire to just be human, flawed and all? That you're not being nurturing and loving and caring and maternal as you're expected to be doesn't mean that you failed at anything significant or at anything really, because it just means that you're wired differently, and there's no shame in that. Femininity is flawed, and its flawed nature guilts anyone who dares to be human. Anna speaks of empathy when looking at these so-called unlikable female characters, and I strongly feel that the same applies for women in the real world. Instead of judging yourself severely based on your inability to reach these impossible standards that don't look out for your well-being but only care to mold you into someone society feels most comfortable embracing, even at the expense of your happiness and who you really are, try to look at your so-called shortcomings with empathy and grace. Because whilst men are allowed to be villains without a hope of getting better, women can only be messy for so long with an unspoken expectation that she'll turn away from her transgressions and turn back into the right path before the movie ends. Anna also briefly mentions how the transgressions of the unlikable female characters is a made-up rule, because these quote-unquote transgressions, although labeled as your doom because now you're a bad woman who's going to marry you, are more than just a question of morality. Because whether or not I speak up for myself when I'm being disrespected or treated unfairly isn't a question of whether or not I am morally upright. So why then should I be labeled a quote-unquote bad woman if I choose not to stay silent about my sufferings? Anna goes on to write that they went after the things they wanted, and I thought, even before I had the awareness or the language to articulate it, that if they could do all those things, maybe I could too. And if I messed up, I could just get back up again and not be ruined. It's not about relatability, it's about permission to fail and be flawed. The thing is though, it's not about me at all. I'm just tired of trying so hard to pretend to be superhuman, of bending in incongruous ways to try and fit into a box that was not designed for me or any woman to begin with. But who isn't? Thinking of these characters deemed unlikable, I'm not thinking about which bits of myself I can see in them. I'm living out a fantasy in which I don't care whether people like me or not. I have a problem with boxes. I want the world to be complicated, layered, and flawed. I want to make mistakes and have the possibility of learning from them. They can be flawed, malicious, self-serving, ruthless, hapless characters, but ultimately, unlikable female characters are liberating because they are not meant to be seen as morality lessons within their stories. Once characters are allowed to let go of the pressure to be nice, to conform to an impossible made-up ideal of how a woman should look and behave, they are allowed to be messy, complicated, angry, vulnerable, and human, and we're allowed to see ourselves in them. And so to end this video, in the words of Terry White, maybe in fact the ultimate act of the unlikable woman is to be recognized and seen, shown to be alive as in the pages of this book, but to say after careful consideration, fuck it, and fuck you, to stay true to her name, to remain proudly unlikable. Maybe that's what freedom really looks like. For them, for me, and for you. And so to end this video on a lighter note, a reminder that the world is not all doom and gray, a meme from my weekly collection, or at least my weekly collection from like months ago, or was it like last year? Anywho, literally one of my favorite memes of all time, and the only reason I'm not laughing now is because I've laughed at it so many times I can't even pretend laugh. So thank you so much for watching this video. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more future content. Oh, and comment down below any thoughts or ideas that you may have as a little interactive safe space. Remember to keep all comments respectful and to follow community guidelines. And with all that has been said, I will see you guys in my next video. Until then, stay safe and drink lots of water, as it's good for your health. I've literally been drinking lots of water whilst recording this, so have fun.